Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the Swedes took a break from the seemingly endless war in the Holy Roman Empire by launching a surprise attack on Denmark. It may not have been the most honorable act in the history of warfare, but it worked. Sweden managed to conquer several Danish provinces and receive toll-free passage in and out of the Baltic Sea through the Øresund Strait. Denmark came out of the war reeling, losing both territory and its dominating position in the Baltic Sea. Even though he'd failed to see it coming, King Christian IV came out of the conflict with an air of a war hero, thanks to his brave fighting during the naval battle at Kolberger Heath, where he even lost an eye. But there was no papering over the fact that the war had been a disaster for him, just like for Denmark. The king lost not only prestige, but also a significant part of his personal income when the peace agreement slashed his income from the sound dues in the Øresund Strait. This didn't just mean that King Christian had to tighten the belt and look over his personal spending, which he didn't. It was also a political problem. The king had used his wealth in the domestic political game. Today, we'll take a closer look at how he used his personal wealth and his personal life, that is, his partners and his children, to strengthen his position, and to what extent that was a successful strategy. Episode 93, The Family Firm. By the time the Torstenson War ended in 1645, Christian IV had been king for a long time, 57 years to be exact. No other Danish monarch before or since has reigned for such a long time. Christian became king back in 1588, when he was only a child of 10 years. The first 8 years of his reign, when he was still underaged, Denmark had been governed by a regency government, consisting of various noblemen from the uppermost echelons of Danish society. These aristocrats didn't just run the country, they also brought up the young king. This made an indelible mark on Christian and shaped his worldview. Throughout his life, he'd favor the aristocracy and be a supporter of the idea that the nobility was the backbone of the kingdom, and that only they could run the place. This did not, however, mean that the relations between the nobility and the crown would be smooth and free of friction during Christian IV's time on the throne. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Christian was still a dashing young monarch, and he needed to get married. Like so many other kings throughout the ages, Christian IV made a dynastic match and married a suitable princess that would strengthen the kingdom's position on the international stage. In his case, it was Princess Anne Catherine of Brandenburg, who became Queen of Denmark by marrying Christian in 1597. The new Danish queen was actually the aunt of Gustavus Adolphus's wife, the Swedish queen Maria Eleonora. We'll talk more about her next time. The connection to Brandenburg was important to Denmark, since it was one of the largest Protestant principalities in the Holy Roman Empire, and it was located fairly close to Scandinavia as well, without being so close as to risk competing with Denmark geopolitically. In other words, Anne Catherine was an excellent choice from a political point of view. On a personal level, we don't know much about her. She was considered rather shy and quite pious. She was also pregnant a lot, giving birth to 7 kids, 3 of which survived to adulthood during the 15 years of marriage. The marriage ended with Queen Anne Catherine's death in 1612. At the time, King Christian was 35 and felt he was too young to give up on love. He enjoyed female company far too much for that. In fact, he'd been enjoying the company of other females for years even before his wife died. Still, it was widely assumed that he'd also remarry eventually, and 3 years after Queen Anne Catherine's death, King Christian had found the woman he wanted to make wife number 2. Her name was Kirsten Munk, and she was a young aristocratic woman. The king fell madly in love with her and contacted her mother, asking for Kirsten's hand in marriage. The reason he turned to the girl's mother was that the father was dead. In fact, her mother, Ellen Marsvin, was twice widowed, and thanks to her 2 marriages, she'd become one of the richest women and largest landowners in Denmark. She was business savvy and recognized a good deal when she saw one. So when the 38-year-old king wanted to marry her 17-year-old daughter, she understood how good this could be for her and her family. The king's sisters, on the other hand, were less thrilled when they heard about the upcoming nuptials. All 3 were married off to various German dukes, and now they tried to convince their brother that marrying a Danish noblewoman was a mistake, a step too far down. He should instead find a suitable foreign princess, preferably, of course, from one of the German dynasties they had married into. But King Christian dismissed his sister's protests. He didn't need another dynastic marriage. Queen Anne Catherine had already given him 3 surviving sons, so he had an heir and 2 spares with a proper pedigree. Now he wanted to marry for love. The marriage may have been a love match, but it wasn't a union of equals. Kirsten had to accept that this would be a morganatic marriage, meaning that she did not become queen and her children would be excluded from the line of succession. They didn't even have a church wedding, but rather just agreed to be married in the sight of witnesses. That was enough, according to the laws and customs of the 17th century Denmark, but it further marked the lower status of both the bride and the marriage. I should probably also point out that we don't actually know if it was a love match as far as Kirsten Munk was concerned. Even though love letters from the king to her have been preserved, we have none from her to him. There are, of course, those who say that it was her mother who pushed the unwilling teenager to marry the middle-aged king, but there are also no indications of that either. Whether she loved her husband or not, she gave him 10 children in 14 years. This was the time Christian IV was at the height of his power, and so was Denmark. But it was also at this time that Christian made the decision to interfere in the 30 Years' War, and to implement his reckless toll policy in the Øresund Strait that we talked about last time. Christian IV used the money he received from the traffic in and out of the Baltic Sea not only to start wars that the Council of the Realm didn't approve of, but also to build several splendid buildings, such as the Stock Exchange and Rosenborg Castle in Copenhagen. The king also lent large sums of money to various nobles who were in need of cash. Last time, I mentioned briefly that the Danish economy was in trouble because the grain export wasn't fetching the same prices as it had in the past. So many Danish nobles were shifting from crops to livestock, because that was still a lucrative business. But not everyone could afford the change. The nobility was now divided between those who had the money to carry out the shift and those who didn't. Some of the poorer aristocrats had to sell their estates to richer ones, who, in turn, became even richer and more powerful. This created a thin stratum of super rich and powerful aristocrats. Many of the members of this new class of nobles had enjoyed royal loans. In return, Christian expected these nobles, who were in his debt, to side with the crown on the Council of the Realm and in the Assembly of Nobles. Needless to say, many of the Danish aristocrats resented this development, both those who were forced to sell land and those who ended up indebted to the king. They also didn't like that the king seemed to be using his mother-in-law as a straw man to buy up land. You see, in order to limit royal power, the king wasn't allowed to purchase land. But Christian IV had been lending large sums of money to Kirsten Munk's mother, who used the money to buy land from nobles who weren't able to manage the switch from crops to livestock. The tension that had been building under the surface became an open crack in the wake of King Christian's failed intervention in the 30 Years' War. The noblemen on the Council of the Realm couldn't help pointing out to the king that they had warned against this war all along. Christian IV did not appreciate being told, "We told you so," and a rift opened up between him and the aristocracy that would remain for the rest of his reign. His marriage to Kirsten Munk also started to break down at this time. During the winter when Wallenstein stood with his imperial army in Jutland, she took a lover, a German nobleman who was an officer in the Danish army. In the fall of 1628, Kirsten discovered that she was pregnant, and considering that she hadn't been intimate with the king for a long time, she realized the baby couldn't be his. Worse, she knew the king would realize as well. In her desperation, she first tried to have an abortion, which obviously was both illegal and extremely dangerous at the time. When that didn't work, she turned to the Swedish envoy in Copenhagen, begging him to help her escape to Sweden. But he refused, understanding that helping the king's wife to flee the country would lead to all kinds of unnecessary diplomatic complications. But Kirsten Munk was lucky. The king still loved her, and he was desperate to have her back. He even accepted Kirsten's claim that the baby was his, and that this was just the longest human pregnancy in medical history. Still, as far as Kirsten was concerned, this only put her back at square one. She was still stuck with an aging, heavily drinking man that she didn't want in her life, and definitely not in her bed. She also disliked the name the king had chosen for their baby. He decided she'd be known as Dorothea Elizabeth, which also happened to be the same name he'd given to another of his daughters who had been born to one of his mistresses before he met Kirsten Munk. If she couldn't escape him, Kirsten decided to try and get rid of the king. She decided to try and poison him and corresponded with an alchemist in Hamburg about ways to kill her royal husband. Unfortunately for Kirsten, her letters ended up in the king's hands, and when he learned she'd planned to actually kill him, he finally decided to put his foot down. Kirsten Munk was put under house arrest of sorts, and could only see her children during meals. In 1630, she asked to be allowed to leave, and the king agreed. First, Kirsten went to live with her mother, Ellen Marsvin, but she didn't like that Kirsten had left the king, and when she didn't stop pointing this out, Kirsten Munk had enough and moved out. She now traveled around the country, staying at various manor houses, entertaining her noble hosts with her version of why she and the king had split up. This only served to widen the gap between the crown and the nobility. When King Christian heard about Kirsten Munk's tour of slander, he gifted her 2 of the estates he had bought through Ellen Marsvin and ordered her to stay there. The king and Kirsten never saw each other again. But even though she was out of his sight, she was definitely not out of his mind. Every now and then, he would have Kirsten arrested and interrogated in order to make her tell the full story of her love affair with that German officer in the 1620s. Interestingly, and frankly a little surprisingly, they were never divorced, and Kirsten was never formally charged with anything, even though she had conducted an extramarital affair and had planned to kill the king, both criminal offenses. Kirsten's mother, Ellen Marsvin, had watched her daughter's marriage with the king break down in 1629, and she was appalled. She feared the king's retribution if Kirsten left him, and she was determined to get them back together again. Eventually. But it was clear that reunification would take time. In the meantime, Ellen Marsvin was worried that the king would fall in love with some other charming young woman and lose interest in Kirsten Munk. So in order to ensure that the king would be available when her daughter eventually realized it was best for everyone involved if she'd just take him back, Ellen Marsvin set the king up with a temporary replacement. This stopgap mistress was called Vibeke Kruse, and she'd actually served as a maid in Kirsten Munk's retinue. Ellen Marsvin introduced Vibeke Kruse to the king when he was staying at one of Ellen's estates in 1629. Vibeke Kruse was perfect as far as Ellen Marsvin was concerned. She didn't belong to the aristocracy, so a formal relationship or marriage with the king was out of the question. But she was both pretty and charming, and could keep Christian busy until Kirsten got her act together and returned to the king. By the time Ellen Marsvin realized she'd made a mistake, it was already too late. Because since Vibeke Kruse had been serving in Kirsten Munk's household, she knew things about Kirsten's life and infidelities that she could now disclose to the king, driving him further away from his wife, ensuring that he'd stay with Vibeke, even if she only was his mistress. In addition, and unlike Kirsten Munk, the low-born Vibeke was prepared to put the king's needs and wishes first, which he obviously found to be a welcome change. So Vibeke and Christian's relationship became permanent, and she stayed with the king until his death in 1648. She was soon installed at court as a semi-official public secret. Beyond various estates and properties, both in the Duchy of Holstein and in Copenhagen, Vibeke Kruse also received an annual salary of 500, later 600 thaler. For context, that was on par with what a senior member of the royal bureaucracy received. Her children were given the fancy-sounding last name Gyldenlöve, which was granted to all of Christian IV's children born out of wedlock. Now, as fascinating as Christian IV's love life may be, I haven't been talking about it for this long just because I find 400-year-old gossip entertaining. The king's relationships with Kirsten Munk and Vibeke Kruse actually had political consequences that were amplified by the existing rift between the crown and the high nobility. 2 rival camps formed in elite circles in Denmark. On the one hand, those who supported Kirsten Munk and her noble relatives, and on the other, those who supported the king, and therefore Vibeke Kruse. The 2 camps also took opposing sides on the burning question of financing the king's wars and building projects. After the disastrous Emperor's War, where Christian IV had tried and had failed to play the role of the Lion of the North, the king's personal money was running dangerously low. And after the Torstensson War, Christian IV had lost all hope of replenishing his personal coffers via the Öresund toll. Now the roles were reversed. Instead of the king being able to offer the nobility loans in exchange for loyalty, he now needed them to raise taxes to cover the crown's expenses. And the crown had considerable expenses. At the same time as the tax base was already reduced because of the agricultural crisis and the wars, more money was needed for the new permanent army of Danish conscripts that I mentioned last time. The king felt the nobility didn't understand the urgent need to raise money, and that they selfishly tried to avoid contributing. The nobility felt the king was irresponsible, untrustworthy, and wasting money on needless wars, risking the country's security, peace, and financial stability. The nobility also objected to the very idea of a standing army under direct royal control, paid for by taxes, instead of a temporary army provided by the nobles themselves whenever it was needed. The aristocrats worried that this permanent military force beyond their control would undermine their power, influence, and privileges in the long run. They weren't wrong, but that's a story for another time. As if the relations between the king and the nobility weren't strained enough as it was, an incident occurred during the Emperor's War that gave the Danish aristocrats even further reason to distrust the king. It also involved a mistress, but in this case the mistress of the heir apparent, Prince Christian. Yes, King Christian named his first son Christian. He named everything else after himself, so why not his son? Anyway, the woman in question was a young noblewoman called Anne Lykke. She was a widow in her late 20s with a daughter. The king did not like the idea that his son and heir had a mistress, even though her father was a member of the Council of the Realm. So what did the concerned king do? Did he sit his son down, explain the situation, and urged him to think of the future of the crown? Did he appeal to the better nature of the young woman in question? Of course not. King Christian promptly had the young woman arrested to separate her from the prince. She was only released on condition that she go and stay at her estate in the country, far away from Copenhagen and the prince. To make sure that she did as she was told, the king also took her daughter away from her and kept her as a sort of glorified hostage. Unfortunately for the king, Anne Lykke didn't accept this arrangement. She was a proud aristocrat from an important family. She couldn't be intimidated so easily. In her eyes, King Christian's demands violated her privileges as a member of the nobility, and most other aristocrats agreed with her. Whatever they may have thought about extramarital affairs, they were worried about the king's high-handed approach. It made them question the king's respect for the law, and what he might do to them if he would be allowed to get away with this. In the face of what he saw as insolence, Christian IV threatened to formally charge Anne Lykke. Sex outside of marriage was, of course, a serious crime at the time. But in the end, the king's mother, the Dowager Queen Sophie, talked him out of it. After all, a court case would have involved the heir to the throne. The public scandal would have weakened the crown and undermined Christian's successor. Anne Lykke got her daughter back, but she still had to retire to her estate, which she did. You could argue that the king's wrath was just a tad hypocritical, considering Christian IV's own lifestyle. But the king wouldn't have agreed. The prince wasn't married yet, and the king didn't want him risking getting turned down by potential princely fathers-in-law because he was conducting an affair too openly with a woman who enjoyed an independent position in high society. In addition, the king worried that the relationship with Anne Lykke might have caused the heir to the throne to sympathize too much with the nobility and their agenda in the growing conflict with the crown. Who knows? Maybe the whole thing had even been a plot by a coterie of aristocrats to ensnare Prince Christian and win him for their cause. That may sound slightly paranoid, but after all, Christian IV himself wasn't beyond using his children for political aims, so why should his opponents be? Speaking of King Christian's children, there were a lot of them, over a dozen that we know of, and they were divided into three distinct categories. First, we have the Queen's children. The offspring of the shy and pious Anne Catherine were royalty. Three of them reached adulthood, namely Christian, the heir apparent, Frederick, and Ulrich. Below them in rank, we have the children of Kirsten Munk. Kirsten and Christian were married, and the king had given her the title of Countess of Schleswig-Holstein, so her children were also of high noble rank. Christian IV even tried to solidify an anti-Swedish alliance with the Russians by having Valdemar, his son with Kirsten Munk, marry a Russian princess. But nothing came of it because the Russians demanded that he convert to Russian Orthodoxy. When Valdemar refused, the marriage was called off, but Valdemar wasn't allowed to leave Russia. Only when the Tsar died a year and a half later, he could return to Denmark. King Christian didn't even try to arrange royal marriages for Kirsten Munk's many daughters. He knew it would be both fruitless and humiliating to try, since they weren't princesses. Still, on the domestic noble marriage markets, they were in high demand, and Christian IV married them off strategically to noblemen he wanted an alliance with. These sons-in-law were then given key positions in the government. One of these sons-in-law was Hannibal Sehested, who was appointed Governor-General of Norway soon after his marriage to the king's daughter Christiane. It's after him that the Torstensson War is called the Hannibal War in Norway. He'd actually been a competent governor of Christian IV's Second Kingdom, and he had strengthened Norway's economy and army. But any goodwill the Norwegians may have felt towards him was largely wasted when he followed his father-in-law's command and attacked Sweden during the Torstensson War. Most Norwegians wanted to stay out of the war because they feared the cost, in money and blood. In the end, they also lost 2 provinces to Sweden, so it's easy to see why they'd resent Hannibal dragging them into the fighting. Another son-in-law was a certain Corfitz Ulfeldt, who will pop up again in our story, so remember his name. He would eventually be even less popular than Hannibal Sehested, and arguably much more deservedly so. The third category consisted of all the children born out of wedlock to the king's various commoner mistresses, including Vibeke Kruse. They were all given the last name Gyldenlöve, that's Golden Lion, and despite their technical status as bastards, they also fared well in life thanks to their royal father. Among them were the diplomat and officer Christian Ulrich, the Admiral Hans Ulrich, and the General Ulrich Christian. So yeah, Christian IV was many things. An imaginative name-giver was not one of them. Anyway, as I mentioned, King Christian showered his noble sons-in-law with various favors, including seats on the Council of the Realm. He didn't do this out of the goodness of his heart, though. He expected his daughters' husbands to be grateful, and more importantly, to vote with him against the nobility if needed. In that way, his sons-in-law were a political tool, just like his money-lending had been. This was a tactic with mixed success, partly because the sons-in-law don't seem to have been the most studious, honorable, and virtuous of people. One historian, sympathetic to the king, has even characterized them as a bunch of unusually unsavory people. But maybe they weren't. I find it hard to believe that Christian IV would have gone out of his way to find shady young men to marry his daughters. Another reason for the sons-in-law not bending to the king's will was that it wasn't in their political interest. Instead of siding with their father-in-law, their sympathies rested with their mother-in-law, Kirsten Munk, who belonged to their social class and who they felt had been wronged by the king. Many of King Christian's own daughters also took their mother's side, and it seems likely that they also influenced their husbands. Personally, I find that explanation at least as compelling as the idea that they were simply bad people. A consequence of the sons-in-law siding with the council, the nobility, and Kirsten Munk was that they were vehemently against the commoner Vibeke Kruse and her children, sensing that they might become a threat to their status as high-born children within wedlock. They were rude to Vibeke, and in 1644, when the king was away from the capital on some errand, his son-in-law, Corfitz Ulfeldt, who I mentioned earlier, even blocked the payment of Vibeke Kruse's annual stipend. Conversely, the so-called natural children born out of wedlock to his mistresses, Vibeke Kruse and others, all sided with the king against the nobility because they didn't have family or aristocratic connections. Without the king's support and protection, they had nothing. To go against the king would have been to destroy their own lives, and most likely that of their relatives as well. These really loyal children were much more useful to the king, even though he couldn't place them on the Council of the Realm. As I mentioned before, he gave all these sons various high military positions, as well as the name Ulrich. As you may have gathered by now, the last years of King Christian's life were poisoned by Swedish military successes and tension with the Danish nobility, including his children and in-laws. Christian IV is the Danish monarch who've reigned the longest, an impressive 60 years. It was during his time on the throne that Denmark reached its peak in terms of territory and power. He's remembered as the king who reigned during the glory days of Denmark. But it was also during his reign that the decline started. One of the reasons was the military defeats against the Holy Roman Empire and Sweden. Another reason was the chronic money problems the crown found itself in toward the end of his reign. Christian IV had inherited a strong, stable and financially solvent kingdom. He left a weakened and cash-strapped country to his heir. Christian's motto was Regna firmat pietas, meaning piety strengthens the kingdoms, referring to Denmark and Norway. The motto was abbreviated RFP on the coins, and Christian's more cynical subjects would joke that it should really be read as Riget fattes penge, which is Danish for the kingdom lacks money. In his final years, the king was also in poor health, and many of his duties were carried out by his trusted son-in-law, Corfitz Ulfeldt, who wasn't just any member of the council, but steward of the realm. Unfortunately, it wasn't the best appointment. In his elevated position, Ulfeldt enriched himself and put himself and his office above all else. The aging Christian IV turned a blind eye to the blatant corruption, as long as he hoped Ulfeldt would side with him against the council. But when Ulfeldt openly took Kirsten Munk's side, the king started to look into his dealings. But it was too late. Even as Ulfeldt more or less turned into the spokesperson for the aristocratic party against the king, King Christian was getting so sick and weak that he couldn't do much to stop his son-in-law. Christian IV took comfort in the company of Vibeke Kruse, but in early 1647 she fell ill. The king suspected that the people in the Munk camp had poisoned her. He even initiated an investigation, but nothing came of it. Then, in June, the heir apparent, Prince Christian, died. Apparently, this wasn't so much a personal tragedy for the king, who wasn't close to his eldest son and heir, but it was a political complication. The most natural thing would have been to make his second son with the queen, Frederick, the heir. But Denmark wasn't a hereditary monarchy, so the Council of the Realm and the Assembly of Nobles had to consent. The old and sick king wanted to call a meeting and settle the matter quickly, but the council dragged their feet. If the king died before a new heir was appointed, the burden of ruling the country would fall to them, and that was a burden they would be all too happy to carry. In order to obtain the council's consent to call a meeting that would appoint a new heir, the king had to agree to scrap a planned reform of the local administration. This reform was supposed to have made the bureaucracy more effective and centralized. It would also have brought in more money to the crown, but it would have weakened the local nobility, who would get fewer cushy jobs in the local administration. So they demanded that this much-needed reform be stopped if the king wanted to make Prince Frederick his new heir. The king also had to agree to release Kirsten Munk from her house arrest and give Corfitz Ulfeldt general immunity against legal procedures, especially for corruption and other things that he was very much guilty of. Once they had been properly placated, the Council of the Realm agreed to arrange an election in April 1648. But events soon overtook both them and the king. In February that year, Christian IV fell ill, and sensing that his end was near, he asked to be brought to Copenhagen to see his capital one last time. He reached Rosenborg, the castle he'd built in the capital, together with Vibeke Kruse and one of their daughters. But at the castle, Corfitz Ulfeldt and his wife, the king's daughter Leonora Christina, immediately took charge. They blocked access to the king for Vibeke and her daughter, and also made sure that Frederick, the man who was supposed to take over as king, was kept in the dark about his father's illness and not called to Copenhagen. Instead, they summoned Kirsten Munk to come and sit by the dying king's side. Not because they thought she wanted to say goodbye or anything, but because that would stress her closeness to the king and therefore also elevate their own positions. As soon as the king died on February 28th, Corfitz Ulfeldt, as steward of the realm, became regent. He wasted no time. First of all, he threw Vibeke Kruse and her daughter out of the castle. They weren't even allowed the dignity of a proper carriage when they left. Then he went about destroying all kinds of sensitive papers and other documentation that could incriminate himself or anyone else in the Munk camp. Then the Ulfeldts went on the offensive. On April 13th, Kirsten Munk, her son, and 3 sons-in-law wrote to the Council of the Realm demanding that Vibeke Kruse be put on trial. They accused her of all kinds of immoral behavior, especially lying and extramarital sex. At least the latter was obviously true and a crime. They asked for a secret trial to safeguard the honor of the dead king, but threatened to take the law into their own hands if the council didn't agree to their demands. But the council didn't want to go that far. They were worried that the Munch family was becoming too powerful and too threatening. This menace could easily be turned on someone else. They didn't agree to a summary trial to punish Vibeke Kruse. And either way, just a few days later, Kruse died from the sickness she had been suffering from for a year or so. As a last act of petty revenge, the Ulfeldts made sure she wasn't buried in the honorable spot the king had chosen for her, but instead in the pauper's graveyard outside of the Copenhagen city walls. At night, without ceremony. The council did agree that Munch had suffered unjustly at the hands of the king, and that her children were legitimate, but not on the same level as the princely children of the late queen. That meant Kirsten Munch's children were explicitly excluded from the line of succession. So Munch and her son and sons-in-law couldn't stop Duke Frederick from being elected King Frederick III in April. But before he was elected king, Frederick had to agree to limit his powers to such a degree that he became little more than a puppet for the real power in Denmark, the Council of the Realm and the high nobility. Now, the crown was weaker than it had been in a long time, maybe ever. As Denmark was weakened, the nobility grew stronger. The aristocrats seemed set to run the show for the foreseeable future. Next time, we'll have a look at what was happening in Sweden. The situation there was actually not too different from the domestic Danish developments. The death of the strong king, Gustavus Adolphus, had led to a power vacuum, which the nobility had managed to exploit to further its own interests. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop, or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer Twitter, or X as it's called these days, then you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.